You're listening to a mini episode of the Practical Permaculture Podcast.
Hey everyone, just Elise here today for a mini episode on hot composting. So I've been dabbling in this a fair bit, trying to get all the resources and get everything ready for my hot compost. So I thought I would jump in and share some of the things you need to think about. And the main thing is the composition of your compost, which will consist of either greens or browns. So greens are the nitrogen source in your compost. They provide nutrients and they provide moisture. Some examples of greens would be things like lawn clippings, fresh lawn clippings, any garden greens you have. So, in a permaculture garden, that's often comfrey, it's nasturtiums. Definitely at the end of seasons, when you're getting all your zucchini and your cucumber out and your pumpkin, all those vines, that's great, especially when it's fresh for your compost as a green. Any weeds that you find, or volunteer plants that aren't in the place they're meant to be. They're great to put in the compost as a green. Coffee grounds, even though they are brown looking, they are a green. Food scraps and animal manure. They are all considered greens or nitrogen sources for your compost. Then we have the browns. So these are things that are carbon sources. They provide energy, and they're also really good at absorbing any excess moisture, so you don't get those soggy kind of compost compositions. They give structural integrity to your pile, and they let air in as well, which is really important. So they keep it porous, they allow the air to flow, and they make sure nothing gets compacted, because hot composts are an aerobic process. They need air. So these things are normally things that aren't alive anymore, I guess is the best way to put it. So they're things like hay, mulch, brown leaves, pine needles, little dead twigs, straw, sawdust is another good one, and obviously paper and cardboard are a good source of carbon. And then you have things that would be considered halvesies. So they're things like when you muck out a stable or your chicken coop, or I don't know, your donkeys. I don't know what animals you have on your place, but any of that kind of stuff. Your rabbit hutch, who knows what you have on your place, but those things could be considered halvesies. So they're not quite nitrogen and they're not quite carbon. They're kind of a mix of the two. On top of that, you have things that are considered compost accelerators. So these are things like weed and poo teas. So when you get a bag and you literally like make a tea out of these materials, and then you use that as an accelerator and you put it in between the layers. So that's something to think about too. Having a proper mix of green and brown materials will ensure that your compost pile works correctly. So without a good mix of greens and browns, it can take a long time to break down. It might not get hot enough. It might not make a usable compost, and it can kind of get funky and smell bad. So that's not what you want when you're doing a hot compost. It should smell lovely and earthy when you're turning it. So a good mix of greens and browns is about 2 to 1. So 2 browns to 1 green. Some people say it's closer to 4 to 1, but you need to remember as well that not all greens and browns have 100% carbon or 100% nitrogen in them. So depending on what you're using will depend on what your mix is. But as a good rule, if you go 2 to 1, and diversity is your friend when you're making these compost piles. So the more different greens and the more different browns you can get, the quicker and the warmer and the better and the more nutritious this kind of compost is going to be that you're making. So just keep that in mind. And I think a lot of it is trial and error. See what works for you, see what you have access to, and use the things that you have lying around. We've been using a lot of the straw that gets slashed from the paddock across the road from us, which I'm sure a lot of you heard of, or heard about. We don't have a lot of access to manure around here that I know where it comes from, and I'm going to happily use it on my garden bed. So we've been using a lot of seaweed instead of manure. We have access to lots of coffee grounds, so I've been getting heaps and heaps of that to put not just in our garden but also in our compost. So yeah, just have a think and, think outside the square about how you could access some of these materials. Could you, if you're in an urban area, contact your local gym's mowing and get all the grass clippings so that you can do these composts? Because the thing about these composts is that you need all these materials to make it in one hit. It's not like a cold compost where you can add to it over time, which I learned in my permaculture course. I didn't realize this. So you make it in one big hit, a cubic meter, so 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter high, wide, deep, and then you turn it every couple of days. So you need all of that material. I went and made my first one on my own the other day, and I only had enough material to half fill it. I really underestimated how much material you need on hand in bulk to make the compost in one hit. So that's something to really think about, to make sure that you have everything on hand when you go to make it. So like I said before, it's an aerobic process. It uses air and it will heat up. So your goal is to try and get it to about 60 to 65 degrees. And then every 2 days or so, you are turning it. So you flip what was on the outside on the inside and what's on the inside back onto the outside, so that it all kind of mixes together and that you have a chance to get the stuff that was a bit cooler on the outside hot in the middle this time. So you do that every couple of days. If you have a really good mix, your compost will be ready in about 20 or so days, give or take. So if you're finding problems with your compost, too many greens will make it really soggy, and too many browns won't make it as nutrient dense. So you kind of have to think about that when you're making it. When you first initially make it as well, you do wet it down, but then after that you don't actually need a lot of water through the process. So yeah, that's kind of my little crash course into what I know so far into this. I mean, there's whole books written about this, so I'm definitely still learning. I'm a novice when it comes to this. I might do a little update video in a couple of weeks' time and just share how ours is going, because yeah, this was the first time we made it and I really did struggle to get my hands on things. So it was kind of a slow compost at the start and ended up turning into a hot compost once I got enough of the materials. But you got to start somewhere. So yeah, if you have any questions, hit us up in the comments. There's some really good books that talk about this. Compost Kate's new book was definitely something that I enjoyed reading and delving into. Especially we have a bokashi bin, so we actually use the fermented food scraps in our compost rather than just putting them in there raw, because I find that can make a bit of a soggy, or I've heard, that it can make a bit of a soggy compost, so having them already broken down. And that was one thing that did pop up in our permaculture course, to not use too many food scraps because you will get quite a wet, soggy mix. The other book that I really love is Good Life Growing by Hannah Maloney. So she's got a section on composting in her book, which highlights the percentages and things like that really well, and it's a very no-nonsense guide. But yeah, there's lots of resources out there. So have a look and yeah, hit us up if you have any questions or comments. We'd love to hear about your hot composting journey and where you source your greens and your browns. Thanks for listening to the Practical Permaculture podcast. Jump onto our Facebook group to keep the chat going and to look for any resources that we mentioned on today's show. Look in the show notes.
And if you liked the episode today, then subscribe. Please give us a review and share. And if you didn't, then that's okay. We'll sure you'll find the right podcast for you.
Bye.
Bye.